The greatest civilizations in the ancient world were shaped by the rise of legendary lawgivers, who sought to bring order and justice to their maligned societies. Figures like Hammurabi of the old Babylonian Empire established one of the earliest known legal codes, setting the precedent and sparking legislative revolution. And in the Kingdom of Israel, Moses was revered as the legendary lawgiver who delivered divine commandments on stone tablets. Both legal systems generated ethical and religious reforms that laid the foundation for global progress and development. But across the sea from Moses and Hammurabi, in ancient Greece, a different kind of reform was taking shape in a culture steeped in myth and oral tradition. From the social and economic tensions of the city-state Athens emerged Solon, a statesman, poet, and lawgiver born in the year 640 BC. Celebrated as one of the 7 legendary sages of Greece, Solon addressed the problems of his time by skillfully balancing the interests of both rich and poor, and became the forerunner of what would become Athenian democracy. Active at the same time as the biblical events known as the Babylonian exile, this is a story of what was happening just outside the biblical world of the time that would eventually impact the whole world. This is the adventures of Solon. Athens in the 7th century BC was in a deeply fractured state. All land and wealth was concentrated into the hands of the aristocracy. Small farmers were crushed by colossal debts, and when they couldn't oblige, both they and their children could be seized as collateral. Aristotle would later describe this sad state of affairs in his own Constitution of the Athenians.
All the land was in the hands of the few, and if the poor failed to pay their rents, both they and their children were liable to seizure. All loans were made on the security of the person.
So as debt slavery spread misery through the countryside, the aristocracy owned the lion's share. This was an age on the brink of class war. Everyone could feel it, and a concrete solution was needed before an inevitably successful revolt. This problem was acknowledged around 622 BC, when the Athenians commissioned the brutal statesman Draco to write down and codify the laws of Athens. The laws were never written down before this point. They were always kept orally and were fluid, something the aristocracy took advantage of. And so draconian law was ratified. Nearly every crime, even idleness, became punishable by death. A sharp pendulum swing that did little to promote the peace. It was into this society that Solon grew up and was destined to reform. Born in Athens in 640 BC, Solon came from a respected family from the island of Salamis, a sharply disputed territory between Athens and the neighboring city-state Megara. Though his family had noble roots, Solon's father, Execestides, allegedly bankrupted the name after overgiving to the poor. Though he was offered relief from wealthy friends as a favor, Solon instead turned to various innovative trades to earn wealth on his own terms, and spent his young years traveling as a merchant across the Mediterranean. The life of a merchant was seen as below the dignity of someone like Solon, but this unusual path gave him a unique perspective that few of his contemporaries shared. Wherever he traveled and learned, he witnessed the plight of the poor firsthand, becoming convinced that the worth of men does not subsist in property, but in character and skill. Solon would rise in reputation as a man of integrity and balance, with a rare degree of respect from both the rich and the poor men, a tightrope he walked well. At some point later in his public career, Solon served as a member of the Areopagus, a counseling body of legislators who also oversaw serious crimes. Success in the Areopagus ultimately led to the year 594 BC, where Solon was elected as the eponymous archon, the chief magistrate of Athens. This position invested Solon with full power to reform the state that his predecessor Draco had dehumanized. Solon wasted no time. His term as archon was only a 1-year appointment. He immediately repealed the most violent of the draconian laws, except for those concerning homicide. But Solon's most famous reform came to be known as the seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens. All financial debts were absolved, mortgages were annulled, craftsmen immigrants were granted citizenship, and Athenians sold into slavery because of debt were freed. Even those sold abroad, the state ransomed back at public expense. Solon's reform was, by all accounts, a jubilee year. To borrow that term from the biblical world, Solon was to civic peace in Athens what King Josiah was to covenant peace in Judah, both accomplishing their deeds within years of each other. But Athens would reform further. Solon reorganized the class system away from a focus on birthright to wealth, opening up political opportunities beyond the nobility. He created new councils, new rights of appeal, and gave the assembly of citizens greater voice in government. The common man made critical strides under Solon toward just and equal recognition before the law, and the seeds of democracy were sown. Solon's claim to fame was not only as a respected tradesman, legislator, or even reformer. He was also a clever strategist, channeling the same heroic cunning as the mythical Odysseus. Between Athens and its rival city-state Megara lay the island of Salamis, the ancestral land of Solon's family, a strategic island along the trade routes in the Saronic Gulf. These two city-states had fought so bitterly over its possession that as a reaction, the Athenians passed a law before Solon's time in office. Anyone who even proposed another war for the repossession of Salamis would be put to death on the spot. At the height of Solon's influence, he recognized the need to retake the island. Whoever controlled Salamis controlled maritime trade, but the idea of repossession was scandalous and unpopular. So instead of drafting a formal proposal and risking the death penalty, the historiographer Plutarch claims that Solon pretended for a time to be clinically insane, holed himself up in his residence, and drafted his petition for war as poetry, not a legal request, in which he urged Athens in prose to resume the fight. All of this he successfully feigned and recited in the public square, striking the legislators with such admiration that the law was repealed and a war party was formed. Plutarch again records one of Solon's clever stratagems. During a festival taking place on Salamis, he disguised and dressed up his young men as attractive women, armed them with daggers, and lured the Megarian men to rout back to the island, to check things out. The result was an ambush, a bloodbath, and an Athenian victory, all from the mind of Solon. The war for the island of Salamis dragged on still, and Athens and Megara agreed to appeal to Sparta to arbitrate their dispute. Solon was, again, a critical voice during the disputation, turning to the revered pages of Homer's Iliad to convince the council that Salamis was the right of Athens, not Megara. For context, the Greeks revered Homer's Iliad as a sacred writing, which templated their history and laws in poetic form. To draw precedent from Homer was akin to taking Mosaic precedent from the Bible. Solon pointed to a particular passage in the Iliad, known to us today as the Catalogue of Ships. It says,
Ajax brought 12 ships from Salamis and beached them near the Athenians' camp.
A simple verse regarded as divine by the Greeks, assumed to be from Homer. The thing is, by Solon's time there was no singular, canonical version of the Iliad, leading many to believe that Solon inserted these lines himself. By this variant verse, which is adopted into all copies of the Iliad today, Solon successfully persuaded all pious Greeks over to his side. The third party, Sparta, awarded the island of Salamis to Athens, and Solon had inevitably resolved decades of dispute through a well-placed forgery. Having given Athens new laws and reform, Solon sought to remove himself from the temptation of tyranny, as his fame had become mythical, the perfect man to rule a new dynasty. But sometime after his archonship was over, Solon made the Athenians swear an oath to keep his laws unaltered for at least 10 years. With their agreement, he then undertook a self-exile and spent his later years traveling the world. Solon's reforms were preserved as is on wooden tablets that could be turned on axles. They were displayed in the public square, where the rich and poor alike could see and learn. Now this is where the historical Solon becomes semi-mythical. as his later life contains legendary meetups that seem too good to be true. Herodotus tells us an impressive tale of an aged Solon who first traveled to Egypt to the court of Pharaoh Amasis. Here he learned from the priests about the Egyptian myth of Atlantis, the legendary sunken civilization some thousands of years before their time. This story is preserved and expanded upon later in Plato's Timaeus dialogue, recalling how Solon brought this myth back to Athens and ignited the city with a new mythos. Solon also traveled to the kingdom of Lydia in western modern-day Turkey, where he met the wealthiest king of the age, Croesus. It is said that Croesus displayed his extravagant treasures before Solon and asked him who he thought was the happiest of men, expecting the answer, of course, to be of himself. The wise Solon answered unexpectedly, "Only the man who dies well, after a life of virtue, can truly be called happy. Fortune can change abruptly. Wealth does not guarantee lasting happiness." Croesus didn't like this answer and continued to trust in his vast riches. But only a few years later, in 546 BC, Croesus arrogantly challenged the rising Persian king Cyrus the Great in open battle and was swiftly defeated, having trusted in the vastness of his riches. Croesus then remembered the truth of Solon's words, as if a prophecy had just been fulfilled. Croesus was to be burned at the stake before Cyrus as the defeated king, but as the flames started to rise, he cried out one last time, "Solon! Solon!" This apparently moved Cyrus, who may have thought Croesus was invoking a god, so he asked the meaning of this, and came to conclude that Croesus had wisdom, even if hard-fought, and eventually took him down from the fire, sparing his life. So because of this invocation of Solon, Croesus was spared and became an advisor in Cyrus's court, striking up a friendship. The story of Solon is not merely about Athens. It is about the longing human search for justice. While Judah turned to the law of Moses, Athens turned to the laws of Solon. Both were commissions in ordering society, pointing to something higher than mere power. Solon's reforms did not end Athens' struggles. The age of tyrants would soon arise under his own cousin Pisistratus, but the contributions he made spoke to global progression at a time when the nations were learning the fragile art of justice.